stared at the data screen with all four of its eyes, trying to make sense of what it was seeing. The numbers couldn't be right. In 3,000 years of analyzing how different species handled disaster, had never seen anything like this. The Confederation's Tragedy Analysis Bureau existed for one purpose: to understand how civilizations responded to catastrophic loss. Every species that reached the stars carried scars from their past. The Bureau studied these scars, tracked patterns, and built predictive models. Those models were never wrong, until now. Adjusted the data parameters again, convinced there must be an error in the collection algorithms. The pattern remained unchanged. Humanity's response to tragedy violated every known psychological principle. "You're still looking at the humans," floated over to his workstation, their translucent form rippling with curiosity. "Belonged to a species that had experienced a planetary extinction event 2 million years ago. Only their digital consciousness survived. They understood loss." "The data makes no sense," said, gesturing at the screen. "Look at this. Earth year 1666, the Great Fire of London, massive destruction. Standard response would be trauma, followed by either collapse or slow rebuilding to previous baseline. And instead, they built better, not just rebuilt, better. They created new building codes, fire safety systems, urban planning regulations. Within one generation, their cities were more advanced than before the fire." Studied the data. Interesting, but hardly unprecedented. Some species show adaptive response to single events. It's not a single event. Pulled up more data, screen after screen filling with information. Earth year 1912, a ship called Titanic sinks. Over 1,500 dead. Tragic, but statistically minor for a species their size. Standard response would be temporary increase in caution, gradual return to previous safety standards. But they didn't. They revolutionized maritime safety across their entire world. Mandatory lifeboats for everyone, 24-hour radio watches, ice patrols, international safety treaties, all from one ship sinking. Continued pulling up examples, the passion in its voice growing stronger. Earth year 1918, a pandemic kills millions. They respond by creating new public health systems, advancing medical research, building international health organizations. Earth year 1945, atomic weapons used in war. They immediately create non-proliferation treaties and international atomic energy agencies. "Perhaps they're simply a cautious species," suggested. "That's what I thought at first, but look closer. They're not cautious. They're reckless by any reasonable standard. They keep trying dangerous things. Space exploration, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence. Every field where other species proceed slowly because of past disasters, humans charge forward." Brought up a comparison chart. Here's the pattern for a typical species after major technological disaster. See the decline in innovation, the increase in restrictive regulations, the multi-generational recovery period before they attempt similar projects again. Examine the chart. Yes, standard trauma response. My own species showed this pattern for thousands of years after our near extinction. Now look at humans. Switched screens. Every major disaster shows the same response. Brief period of shock, followed by explosive innovation in the affected field. They don't become cautious. They become obsessed with preventing that specific tragedy from happening again, which drives them to improve faster than they were progressing before the disaster. The data was undeniable. The Challenger space shuttle disaster led to improved safety systems and continued space exploration. The Chernobyl nuclear accident resulted in better reactor designs and enhanced safety protocols, not abandonment of nuclear technology. The 2008 financial crisis produced new financial regulations and economic innovations. "This can't be healthy," said. "Psychologically, they must be under constant stress." That's what I thought too, so I analyzed their cultural outputs during these periods. Literature, art, public discourse. Pulled up more data. There's grief, certainly, but it's paired with something we don't have a proper word for in our language. The closest translation would be determined anger or purposeful rage. Was silent for a long moment. You're saying they get angry at their tragedies. Not at the tragedies themselves, at the conditions that allowed them, and they channel that anger into making those conditions impossible to repeat. Highlighted sections of human communication following disasters. Look at this phrase that appears repeatedly, never again. It's not a hope. It's a declaration of war against circumstance itself. That's not sustainable. Eventually, the grief will overwhelm them. That's what the models predict, but it's been happening for their entire recorded history, thousands of years of this pattern, and they're not slowing down. If anything, the pattern is intensifying. Brought up the most recent data. 3 years ago, Earth time, they experienced a global pandemic. Standard prediction: massive trauma, societal retreat, decreased international cooperation, possible regression. And what happened? They developed multiple effective vaccines in under a year. They advanced remote communication technology by a decade. They transformed their healthcare infrastructure. And now they're aggressively preparing for the next pandemic with a determination that borders on obsessive. Form shimmered with what recognized as unease. This is not how sapient minds are supposed to work. Tragedy should teach caution, not encourage risk-taking. I know. That's why I've been reviewing their psychological literature. Humans have a concept they call post-traumatic growth. Most species have documented post-traumatic stress, but growth, the idea that trauma can make you stronger rather than more fragile, we don't have that in any other species. Pulled up more comparative data. When my species experienced the Great Drought, we became conservative with resources for the next 10,000 years. When they lost their colony ship, they didn't attempt another launch for 800 years. When your species faced extinction, you retreated from physical form entirely. Because that's the rational response to trauma. Protect yourself. Avoid repetition of the traumatic event. Exactly, but humans do the opposite. They run toward the danger, not blindly but with better preparation. Every failure makes them more determined to succeed. Every loss makes them more committed to winning. Floated closer to the screen. What do you think it means? Was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. I think we're observing something that shouldn't be possible according to our understanding of psychology. A species that has somehow turned grief into a renewable energy source. They don't recover from disasters and return to baseline. They use disasters as launching points to exceed their previous capabilities. The Bureau needs to see this. I've already submitted a preliminary report. They rejected it, called it observational bias and statistical anomaly. They said I was overinterpreting limited data. Even with all this evidence, they said trauma response patterns are universal, that I must be missing some factor that explains the apparent anomaly, that human civilization is probably on the verge of collapse from accumulated grief, and I'm observing a temporary spike before the fall. Turned away from the screen, frustration evident in its posture. But I've traced this pattern back through their entire recorded history. This isn't temporary. This is who they are. And nobody will believe me because it contradicts everything we know about how minds handle loss. Was silent for a long time. Finally, they spoke. What are you going to do? Looked at the star map on the wall, finding the small yellow star that held Earth in its orbit. I'm going to request a field study. I need to observe them directly. There's something happening on that world that we don't understand, something that could change everything we know about resilience and adaptation. The Bureau won't approve it. Humans aren't even Confederation members yet. Direct observation requires council approval. Then I'll request a vacation and go anyway. This is too important. Pulled up Earth's information again. Think about it. If humans really can transform tragedy into motivation for improvement, if they've found a way to grow stronger through pain rather than being broken by it, then we need to understand how. Every species in the Confederation carries trauma. What if there's a way to heal that doesn't require forgetting? What if loss doesn't have to mean weakness? Form shimmered thoughtfully. Or what if you're right about the pattern but wrong about it being healthy? What if humans are driving themselves towards some kind of catastrophic breaking point? That's also possible, which is why I need to see for myself. Began preparing documentation for the field study request. Something fundamental separates humans from every other species we've encountered. They look at a burning building and see a blueprint for better architecture. They look at a sunken ship and see the foundation for improved safety systems. They look at death and see an obligation to prevent it from happening again. Most species look at death and see a reason to avoid risk. Exactly. And that might be the difference between a species that reaches the stars and stays there versus one that reaches the stars and keeps pushing further. Saved the documentation and transmitted it to the Bureau. I'm going to Earth. One way or another, I'm going to understand what makes humans different. The approval came through faster than expected. Apparently, someone on the council was also curious about the human anomaly. Within 2 standard cycles, was aboard a transit ship heading toward the Sol system, equipped with translation software, cultural databases, and enough human currency to establish itself on Earth for an extended observation period. The Bureau had provided a disguise field that would make appear human to casual observation. It wouldn't hold up to medical scanning, but it would work for social interaction. The briefing materials emphasized that humans were a contact-ready species, curious rather than xenophobic, though official first contact hadn't been initiated yet. Reviewed the cultural database during the journey, trying to prepare for what it would find. Human society was complex, fragmented into hundreds of distinct cultures with different languages, customs, and histories. But the tragedy response pattern appeared consistent across all of them. Every human culture showed this same tendency to transform loss into motivation. The transit ship dropped at a monitoring station on Earth's moon. From there, a small shuttle carried it down to the planet's surface, landing at a designated observation point away from populated areas. The disguise field activated automatically as stepped onto Earth soil for the first time. Gravity was slightly heavier than's home world, but manageable. The atmosphere tasted strange, rich with oxygen and other organic compounds. The sun felt warm on its synthetic skin. For a moment, just stood there, taking in the fact that it was standing on the world of the species that didn't know how to give up. The plan was simple. Would spend time in several human cities, observing their daily lives, their memorials, their responses to current events. It would interview humans about their personal experiences with loss. It would attend their remembrance ceremonies. And hopefully, it would understand what the data couldn't explain. The first destination was a city called Washington, chosen because it housed several major human memorials. If wanted to understand how humans process tragedy, it made sense to start where they chose to remember it. As the transport vehicle carried toward the city, it watched the landscape pass by. Humans had transformed this planet extensively, covering it with structures and infrastructure. But they'd also preserved natural spaces, creating parks and protected areas. Another contradiction. They rebuilt and improved after disasters, but they also remembered and preserved. The vehicle entered the city and felt its first moment of doubt. This was a living, breathing civilization, far more complex than any database could capture. Could it really understand these beings by walking among them for a few months? But the data didn't lie. The pattern was real. And if could understand it, could learn what made humans different, it might help not just the Confederation, but every species that carried old wounds. The vehicle stopped at a hotel, paid with the provided currency and checked in, the process remarkably smooth thanks to the translation software. The human at the desk smiled and welcomed it to the city, recommending several places to visit. Tomorrow would begin its observations in earnest. But tonight, it stood at the hotel window, looking out at the human city, wondering what secrets it would discover among these strange, resilient beings who refused to let their tragedies define them as victims. Somewhere in this city was the answer to the question that had driven across the stars. How did humans turn pain into progress? And more importantly, could other species learn to do the same? Morning came too quickly. Had spent most of the night reviewing observation protocols and trying to calm its nervous anticipation. Today it would begin direct fieldwork, moving from abstract data analysis to actual interaction with humans. The first destination was the National Mall, a long stretch of open ground lined with memorials and monuments. According to the cultural database, humans came here to remember their history, particularly their losses and struggles. It seemed like the perfect place to begin understanding their relationship with tragedy. Walked slowly through the area, observing everything. The first thing that struck it was how crowded the memorials were. Despite being a normal workday morning, hundreds of humans moved through the spaces, some clearly tourists, others appearing to be local residents. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was the first stop, a long black wall inscribed with thousands of names. Watched as humans approached it, many reaching out to touch specific names, some leaving flowers or small objects. Several were crying openly. A woman stood nearby, explaining the memorial to two young children, moved closer, listening. "This wall has the names of every American who died in the Vietnam War," the woman was saying. "Over 58,000 people. Each one was somebody's child, somebody's friend." One of the children asked, "Why do we have a wall with sad names?" The woman knelt down to the child's level. "Because we need to remember. These people gave their lives and we owe it to them to never forget. And by remembering what happened, we try to make better choices in the future." The child seemed to think about this. "So, we remember the sad things so we can make happy things." The woman smiled sadly. "Something like that, yes." Felt something shift in its understanding. This wasn't just remembrance. It was active, purposeful memory. The humans weren't trying to move past their pain. They were keeping it alive but channeling it. It moved to another memorial, this one dedicated to World War II. The scale was enormous, with walls and pillars and water features. More names, more flowers, more humans touching stone and staring at inscriptions. An elderly man sat on a bench nearby, wearing a jacket covered in military insignia. Approached carefully, using its translation software to ensure proper respect in its speech. "Excuse me, may I ask about this memorial?" The man looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. "You visiting from out of town?" "Yes, very far away. I'm trying to understand American history." The man nodded. "This memorial is for World War II, the big one. Over 400,000 Americans died, millions more from other countries. I'm sorry for your loss. I lost friends there, brothers in arms, best men I ever knew." The man's voice was steady though sad. "That's why we built this, so nobody forgets what war costs, so maybe we think twice before we do it again." "Has it worked? Do you think twice now?" The man laughed, but it was bitter. "We still have wars, we're human, we make mistakes, but we also learn, we also improve. After World War II, we built the United Nations, tried to create ways to solve problems without fighting. Doesn't always work, but it's better than nothing. Every war teaches us something, costs us something. We pay for every lesson in blood." "That sounds painful." "It is, but forgetting would be worse. If we forget, then they died for nothing. If we remember, if we learn, then maybe their sacrifice meant something. Maybe we get a little better each time." Sat on the bench, processing this. "You believe loss can have purpose." "I believe we can give it purpose. Loss just is. It happens. What matters is what we do with it. Do we curl up and quit, or do we stand up and make sure it meant something? This was it. This was the core of the pattern had seen in the data. Humans didn't just grieve. They insisted their grief must have meaning. They transformed loss into obligation. "Thank you for speaking with me," said. The man nodded. "Remember them, that's all any of us can do. Remember and do better." Spent the rest of the day moving through memorials. The Korean War Memorial with its haunting statues. The Holocaust Museum with its overwhelming documentation of genocide. The Pandemic Memorial, recently constructed, with walls of names still being added. At each site the pattern repeated. Humans came to remember. They brought their children. They touched names. They cried. And they spoke about never forgetting, about learning, about doing better. But what struck most was the anger. Not rage or hatred, but a focused, determined anger. These humans were angry that people had died, angry that suffering had occurred, and they channeled that anger into a fierce commitment to prevent similar suffering in the future. Late in the afternoon found itself at the memorial dedicated to a recent mass shooting. Fresh flowers covered the ground, candles burned, and a group of humans held signs demanding change, demanding action, demanding that this tragedy means something. "Never again," one sign read, those words again, the human battle cry. A woman stood organizing the group, her voice loud and clear. "They want us to move on. They want us to forget and accept this as normal, but we won't. We will make their names mean something. We will fight until this can't happen again." The group cheered, some were crying, all were determined. Understood something profound in that moment. Other species experienced tragedy and learned caution. They protected themselves by avoiding risk, by building walls, by retreating to safety. Humans experienced tragedy and learned defiance. They protected themselves by attacking the source of tragedy, by refusing to accept loss as inevitable, by insisting that every death created an obligation to prevent the next one. It was psychologically irrational. It was emotionally exhausting. It was probably unsustainable. But it was also working. Somehow, impossibly, it was working. Humans kept pushing forward, kept improving, kept transforming every setback into motivation for advancement. As the sun set over the memorials, walked back toward its hotel, its mind churning with observations and questions. It had come to Earth expecting to find a species in denial, running from their pain. Instead, it had found a species that weaponized their pain, that turned grief into fuel for change. Tomorrow, it would conduct more interviews, gather more data. But already knew the preliminary report would need revision. The human response to tragedy wasn't an anomaly or a statistical error. It was a fundamental part of their psychology, a core feature of their civilization. And it was either the most brilliant evolutionary adaptation had ever encountered, or a ticking time bomb that would eventually destroy them. Only more observation would reveal which. Over the next several weeks, expanded its research beyond memorials, diving deeper into how humans actually lived with their loss. It attended support group meetings, volunteered at crisis centers, and conducted countless informal interviews with humans from all walks of life. The pattern held across every demographic. A retired factory worker described losing in an industrial accident and spending the rest of his career fighting for safety regulations. A doctor spoke about watching a patient die from a treatable condition and dedicating herself to healthcare access. A teacher explained how losing students to preventable causes drove her to become an advocate for policy change. Again and again, humans described the same process. Grief, followed by anger at the preventability of the loss, followed by action to ensure it couldn't happen again. Loss transformed into purpose, pain converted into motivation. But also observe the cost. Support group meetings revealed humans struggling with anxiety, depression, survivor's guilt. The memorial visitors often showed signs of unresolved trauma. The activists burned themselves out fighting for change. This wasn't a painless process. It was costly, both individually and collectively. Yet they continued. Even the humans who acknowledged the emotional toll of their response to tragedy couldn't imagine doing it differently. When asked why they didn't just grieve and move on, the responses were remarkably consistent. How can I move on when it could happen to someone else? If I don't do something, their death means nothing. I owe it to them to make the world safer. Moving on would be betraying their memory. The obligation was central. Humans felt they owed something to the dead, to the lost, to the victims, and that debt could only be paid through action, through improvement, through preventing similar tragedies. Interviewed a trauma psychologist, hopping for professional insight. Dr. Sarah welcomed it to her office, a space filled with books and comfortable chairs. I'm researching how humans process collective tragedy, explained, sticking to its cover story as a foreign researcher. The pattern of responding to loss with activism and reform rather than withdrawal. Doctor nodded thoughtfully. You're talking about post-traumatic growth at a societal level. Is that healthy? Other cultures might consider it unhealthy to use grief as motivation. It's complicated. On an individual level, staying stuck in grief is definitely harmful, but transforming grief into meaningful action, that's actually one of the healthiest responses to trauma. It restores a sense of agency, creates meaning from loss, connects the griever to community and purpose. But at what cost? Don't humans exhaust themselves? Some do, yes. Compassion fatigue is real. Burnout happens. But humans are social creatures. We find meaning in collective action. When we're grieving, feeling like we're doing something useful helps us process that grief. It doesn't erase the pain, but it makes it bearable. Leaned forward. Why not just move on? Why do humans insist on keeping their tragedies alive? Doctor was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Because forgetting feels like betrayal. Because we believe the dead deserve to be remembered. And because we've learned that the cost of forgetting is repetition. When we forget the Holocaust rises. When we forget the pandemic, we lose our preparedness. Memory is protective, even when it's painful. But doesn't that mean you're always carrying your worst moments? Yes, we carry our dead with us. Our losses, our failures, our tragedies. They're part of who we are. Doctor smiled sadly. Other species might find that morbid, but for humans, it's how we honor those we've lost. We carry them forward and we use their memory to build something better. This conversation echoed in mind for days afterward. Humans carried their dead. Other species tried to lay their dead to rest, to move past loss and return to normalcy. But humans refused that comfort. They insisted on carrying the weight of their tragedies forward, generation after generation. It should have broken them. By every psychological model knew, it should have resulted in collective trauma too overwhelming to function. But instead, humans had found a way to make that weight meaningful, to transform it from burden into purpose. Expanded its research to smaller, more personal tragedies. It spent time in schools where students had died, talking to classmates and teachers. It visited neighborhoods rebuilding after natural disasters. It observed families dealing with loss. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. A teenager who lost a friend to drunk driving became an advocate for traffic safety. A community that lost homes to flooding organized for better infrastructure. A family that lost a member to disease fundraised for medical research. The scale didn't matter. From personal loss to national tragedy, humans responded the same way. They grieved, they remembered, and they fought to prevent repetition. But also notice something else, something the data hadn't shown. Humans supported each other through this process. The memorial visitors comforted strangers. The support groups provided community. The activists worked in teams. This wasn't individuals struggling alone. It was a collective effort to transform collective grief. One evening attended a candlelight vigil for victims of a recent tragedy. Hundreds of humans gathered in a park, holding candles and sharing stories. The grief was palpable, but so was the determination. A young woman spoke to the crowd. Her voice broke as she talked about losing her brother, but she pushed through. He would want us to fight. He would want his death to mean something. So we're going to make sure this never happens again. We're going to turn our pain into power and our grief into change. The crowd responded with cheers and applause. Many were crying, but they were also energized, ready to act. Watched this and finally understood. This wasn't denial or suppression. This was alchemy. Humans had somehow learned to transmute the lead of grief into the gold of motivation. They didn't ignore their pain. They refined it, shaped it, weaponized it for constructive purposes. And it was contagious. The woman's determination spread through the crowd. Individual grief became collective purpose. Personal loss became shared obligation. This was what the data had been showing all along. Humans didn't just respond to tragedy individually. They responded collectively, pooling their grief and transforming it together. One person's loss became everyone's motivation. One family's tragedy became the community's call to action. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it was completely alien to every other species had studied. As the vigil ended and the crowd dispersed, still energized despite their grief, knew it needed to report back to the Bureau. This wasn't an anomaly that would correct itself. This wasn't a temporary phenomenon. This was fundamental to human psychology, woven into the fabric of their civilization. But first, it needed to understand one more thing. It needed to know if humans themselves recognized how unusual this trait was, if they had any idea how alien their response to tragedy appeared to observers. The next day, arranged an interview with a philosophy professor, Dr. Williams, who specialized in ethics and human nature. Do humans understand how unusual their response to tragedy is? Asked, once they were settled in the professor's office. Dr. Williams raised an eyebrow. Unusual compared to what? To other cultures. Most respond to tragedy with caution, with retreat, with efforts to protect themselves from similar pain. And humans don't. Humans seem to respond with anger and determination to prevent repetition. You don't become more cautious. You become more aggressive about improvement. Dr. Williams nodded slowly. I suppose that's true. We do tend to respond to problems by attacking them rather than avoiding them. Why? The professor leaned back in his chair, thinking. That's a deep question. I think part of it is that humans have always lived with danger. Throughout our evolution, we faced predators, diseases, natural disasters. We couldn't afford to hide. We had to fight, adapt, overcome. Maybe that's why tragedy doesn't make us retreat. It makes us fight harder. But the psychological cost must be enormous. It is. We carry a lot of pain as a species, but we also create a lot of meaning. When my grandfather died fighting in World War II, that could have been just a senseless loss. But because we built institutions to prevent future wars, because we learned from that conflict, his death wasn't meaningless. It contributed to something larger. Does that comfort you? Not really, no. I'd rather have my grandfather. But since I can't have that, knowing his death mattered, that it taught us something, that we improved because of it. That's better than nothing. Made notes, its mind racing. What if you didn't do this? What if humans just grieved and moved on without trying to prevent future tragedies? Dr. Williams looked disturbed by the question. That would be unbearable. If we experienced loss and learned nothing, changed nothing, prevented nothing, that would make every death pointless. We'd be letting people die for no reason, over and over again. Other cultures might say you're letting people die anyway. That improvement is gradual, and loss is inevitable. Maybe, but at least we're trying. At least we're fighting. Giving up, accepting loss as inevitable. That's not human nature. We refuse to accept that any tragedy is unavoidable. Even if we're wrong, even if some losses are inevitable, we keep fighting like they're not. This was the key insight had been seeking. Humans didn't just transform grief into motivation. They believed they had a moral obligation to do so. Not transforming loss into improvement felt to them like betrayal, like complicity, like accepting defeat. Other species saw caution as wisdom. Humans saw it as surrender. Other species learned from tragedy to avoid risk. Humans learned from tragedy to take more calculated risks. Other species protected themselves through withdrawal. Humans protected themselves through attack. It was a fundamentally different psychology, built on fundamentally different assumptions about agency, responsibility, and the nature of loss itself. As left Dr. Williams's office, it knew the next phase of research would be crucial. It had observed the pattern and understood the psychology. Now it needed to assess the implications. What did this trait mean for humanity's future? What did it mean for the Confederation? And most importantly, what did it mean for any species that might find themselves in conflict with a civilization that responded to defeat by becoming undefeatable? The data had brought to Earth, but the observations here would determine what message it brought back to the stars. Spent the next month conducting comparative research, studying human history in detail to test the limits of the pattern it had observed. It needed to know if this trait had any boundaries, any situations where humans responded differently. The answer was sobering. The pattern held across all contexts. Military defeats led to military innovations. Economic crashes led to financial reforms. Environmental disasters led to conservation efforts. Even existential threats like nuclear weapons, which could have paralyzed humanity with fear, instead spurred arms control treaties and international cooperation. But also discovered the pattern's dark side. Sometimes humans transform their grief into destructive action rather than constructive change. Revenge killings, escalating conflicts, crusades justified by past losses. The same psychological mechanism that drove positive change could also drive cycles of violence. The difference seemed to be whether humans channeled their grief-motivated anger toward preventing future losses or toward punishing those they blamed for past losses. When focused on prevention, the trait was constructive. When focused on retribution, it was destructive. This complexity needed to be documented. Began preparing its formal report for the Bureau, knowing it would be controversial. The implications were too significant to ignore. But before finalizing the report, wanted one more perspective. It arranged a meeting with a retired military general, someone who had experienced loss in combat, and advised on policy afterward. General Reeves met at a coffee shop near her home. She was direct and pragmatic, with the bearing of someone who had made difficult decisions and lived with their consequences. "You want to know how soldiers handle losing their comrades?" she asked after explained its research. "Yes, and how that experience shapes military development afterward." The general nodded. "Every loss hurts. You never get used to it, but you also can't afford to break down. So you take that pain and you channel it into making sure the next mission goes better. You analyze what went wrong. You improve tactics, equipment, training. You make their death count for something." Does that work, psychologically, I mean? For some of us, yes, it gives us purpose. For others, no. They can't move past the loss or they become obsessed with revenge rather than improvement. It's a fine line. Leaned forward. What determines which path someone takes? Support system, mostly. If you have people around you who channel your grief into constructive action, you usually end up in a better place. If you're isolated, or if you're surrounded by people who feed your anger toward destructive ends, that's when things go wrong. This aligned with observations. Humans seem to need community and guidance to transform grief constructively. Left alone or pointed in the wrong direction, the same psychological trait could become harmful. Has this response to loss, made humans better at warfare? Asked. General Reeves considered the question carefully. Yes and no. We've gotten better at fighting, certainly. Every war teaches us lessons we apply to the next one. But we've also gotten better at avoiding war, at finding alternatives, at understanding the cost. The memorials aren't just about honoring the dead. They're about reminding the living what war actually costs. So the same trait that helps you improve at fighting also motivates you to avoid fighting. Exactly. We remember our losses vividly enough that we try like hell not to repeat them. Doesn't always work, but the fact that we remember, that we feel obligated to those we've lost, that keeps us from being casual about conflict. Made extensive notes. This was crucial information for the Confederation. Humanity's response to tragedy made them dangerous in conflict, yes, but it also made them averse to unnecessary conflict. They learned from their losses and improved, but they also remembered the cost of those losses and tried to avoid paying it again. One last question, General. If humans encountered another species in conflict and experienced significant losses, how do you think humanity would respond? The General's eyes sharpened. That's an interesting hypothetical, based on history. We'd grieve, we'd be angry, and then we'd figure out how to make sure it never happened again. If we could negotiate peace, we'd